So I know that that you all, or as a part of this series, even if you weren't here last time, have heard about our work in North Carolina for the Governor's Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, and specifically from task force member Senator Mushtaba Muhammad a few weeks ago. So I don't want to spend too much time on the background of the task force, but I do want to spend a little bit of this opening time highlighting some of the recommendations. And highlighting some of the sort of how we got to this point, and pivot to where we're going now, with a particular focus on the local work, because I understand that's how we want to organize tonight's conversation. So as you may recall, in June of 2020, Governor Cooper created the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice in response to the voices of all North Carolinians who were asking for reforms, and sort of our summer of reckoning, and appointed my boss, Attorney General Josh Stein, and Associate Justice Anita Earls of the North Carolina Supreme Court to co-chair it. The executive order that created the task force did a number of other things, including creating a center at our State Bureau of Investigation for the Center for the Prevention of Law Enforcement Use of Deadly Force. And so parallel work has been going on in other state entities as the task force has continued its work. We issued our report in December of 2020. As you heard earlier, there were 125 recommendations in the report. And you can find that. I'm going to put a slide up at the end with the website where you can find that report, as well as an executive summary, if you don't have the wherewithal for the full report. And there's also a very handy chart. So now what? The executive order that created the task force created it through the end of 2022. And so we are still in existence, and we're just getting started. The governor and both co-chairs were very clear that they did not want this to be a blue ribbon commission where the task force report just sat gathering dust. And so we have reorganized ourselves. During the first phase of our work, we were organized into working groups that were somewhat subject matter based. We've now reorganized ourselves into implementation committees. You see them here on your screen. There is an executive branch implementation committee, a judicial branch implementation committee, a legislative committee, a local policy committee, communications and public education, and data study and evaluations. Those last two are sort of overlapping committees that work on all kinds of issues. I'm going to spend the balance of my time talking about the local policy committee. And I want to be clear that each one of these committees was assigned kind of primary responsibility for an area of recommendations. But of course, these things, can't always be put into clear boxes. And so, different aspects of the task force will be working on different aspects of recommendations, but these are a few that we thought were particularly well placed to be worked on with local stakeholders. And by local stakeholders, you're going to see when I talk through this, I mean law enforcement, but I also mean local government, and I also mean community organizations, and I also mean victim organizations, and I mean grant makers. So, and perhaps there are other stakeholders that we've not yet thought of, and would love to hear from you if there are groups that we should be thinking about in broad strokes that we haven't yet. And so that is sort of how I'm going to organize what I'm going to talk about. And to that end, what the local stakeholder group what the local policy group decided to do was to organize even further. You all are organizers, you can appreciate this, to organize even further into somewhat stakeholder buckets. And this isn't to mean that these are the only stakeholders that are important in a particular recommendation. It couldn't be further from the truth. There are many stakeholders that are important with particular recommendations, but there are stakeholders that have decision-making power when it comes to certain recommendations. And so we wanted to organize ourselves and think about that. And it may be a useful frame for you as you think about how on the local level, sort of outside of legislative strategy, statewide strategy, which of course we also have, and outside of the executive branch and going to cabinet agencies and using executive power, which we also have, how you can go to local stakeholders and local decision makers to try to achieve some of your racial equity goals. So just this first one, I'm breaking the rule that I identified right away. And that is that this is not a set of recommendations that is actually assigned to our local policy group. But because the use of force issues are so critical to what brought the task force into existence and what brought us all together, I felt that it was important to sort of highlight some of the recommendations that were very sort of critical to the task force centering its work. And so the first recommendation is this set of recommendations is all about use of force and the revision of use of force standards. And we're hopeful that there's a chance that some of this will be enacted at the statewide policy level in North Carolina. But these are also things that law enforcement agencies can do starting today to improve their local policy and practice, including making policies prohibiting chokeholds and making policies regarding using the minimum amount of force necessary, requiring officers to have first aid kits and to render aid, requiring a duty to intervene or report excessive use of force, and of course, defining and reporting on their use of force, because that is something that we don't necessarily know as much as we need to know about. So these are all things that I wanted to highlight as important for asking our law enforcement stakeholders to do. And I think that there are things that are very achievable and that there should be a lot of consensus around. Also in this stakeholder bucket is a large number of recommendations regarding investigatory practices. We heard a lot of information at the task force about the fact that on a national level, nearly 40% of drug arrests were for possessing or selling 0.25 grams of drugs or less. And an additional 20% of arrests were for possession between 0.25 and 1 gram. And when the task force heard that, it seemed very clear to us that what we thought was happening in our prosecution and enforcement of drug laws is actually not what's happening. And so the task force was very comfortable with recommending that we should not be using our law enforcement resources on prosecuting drug crimes for such small amounts, for trace amounts of drugs. The task force also, and I put this here as a sort of and marijuana possession. That was one of the things that comes as no surprise that got some of the most media attention, but the task force did recommend that marijuana be immediately decriminalized and that we study a legalization model for North Carolina. But the point there for law enforcement is that law enforcement can de-emphasize and they can't make it legal, right? But they can make it the lowest law enforcement priority, as can prosecutors. So your local prosecutor, your local law enforcement can essentially decriminalize marijuana in your local jurisdiction. There are also recommendations related to consent searches, requiring them to be based on written informed consent, prioritizing traffic stops, and issuing citations and summons to avoid people unnecessarily going into the jail. One more slide on the law enforcement stakeholder bucket. There were a number of recommendations related to community policing, as you see here. I want to highlight this idea, this concept of public acknowledgement of mistakes by law enforcement in order to build community trust. We've already started thinking about how you implement that. And we know that one of the barriers is, frankly, sorry to say, lawyers. I know them, I am one. I think people are concerned about questions of liability, but are not thinking about what healing can be promoted by acknowledgement of mistakes, of mistrust, of community pain. And so we're excited about the possibilities of having that conversation with local jurisdictions in North Carolina, local law enforcement agencies in North Carolina. that's along the same lines of trying to figure out what does it mean to have community policing. I mean, it's a term that people love to throw around, but we're trying to figure out what can we do to actually bring some meaning to that term. And then you see here a recommendation that really is aimed at looking at over-policing and police presence in neighborhoods. And we struggle with this one. We're still trying to figure out, we were working with our data team to figure out what this means, because we don't want to sort of create new problems by saying, well, the data said this is where we should be, so let's just stay here. But at the same time, we want to be able to figure out, well, what is the right way to have a law enforcement presence in a community if you're going to have it, which is obviously a conversation that's happening as well, simultaneous to all of these conversations. In most communities in North Carolina, if not all, we're going to have law enforcement. So then the question is, what is the appropriate way for those law enforcement agencies to deploy their resources, and how do you make sure that Black and brown people are not disproportionately impacted by law enforcement presence negatively. And then I have here a very, very small piece of our conversation and recommendations regarding school resource officers. And I'm excited to hear that Ms. Chavez is going to talk so much about education equity and school to prison pipeline issues. One of the recommendations that we're going to be working on is how can we get community more involved in what's happening with SROs. This was an area where, again, there was a lot of heated debate around the role of SROs in school, and the task force did not get to consensus around that question, just like many communities have not been able to get to consensus around that question. But we did get to consensus around the fact that there are some changes that need to happen, not only in how SROs are selected, but how they're trained and how local schools are trained about what the proper use of an SRO is. Namely, they should not be used to handle disciplinary matters. That's not their purpose and role. So now, I'm going to move to our local government stakeholder bucket. And this next recommendation is really the crux of where we started after use of force. This idea of reimagining public safety, and it means a lot of different things. And you'll see a theme here through the rest of my slides that, one of the things the task force is really focused on is, what we need to not just think about tinkering around the edges. How can we be creative in thinking about what our community should look like? And specifically on this one, it's about adopting strategies to respond to crisis that don't assume that law enforcement is the appropriate way to do that. So whether that be a co-responder model or a cahoots type program that doesn't involve law enforcement at all, or at the very least, a specially trained crisis intervention unit. And the reason that this recommendation is here with local government stakeholders is because, again, it's important not to put that at the foot of law enforcement to figure out, but local communities need to figure out, what do we want to do and what do we want to fund in order to have appropriate response to people and make sure that there aren't bad outcomes for people that really should not be involved in law enforcement. A few other things here that we want to be working on with local government stakeholders, including the formation of local community safety and wellness task forces. This is modeled after something that's happening in my hometown, Durham, North Carolina. It's specifically focused to think about non-law enforcement strategies for promoting community wellness and safety. There are bylaws that local communities can use if they're interested in thinking about something like this in their community. Of course, diversion programs, which we all know work, are so important at every stage of the system, but in particular at those early stages before people get engaged in the criminal justice system in the first place. Funding more behavioral health professionals in schools, that training I was talking about before for school personnel. And again, this is a small piece of our overall bail recommendations, but at the local level, local communities can fund pretrial services that will provide people to help people meet their needs so that they can be successful in the pretrial process, and really de-emphasize financial conditions of release, which we know can be so damaging to people and are applied with racial inequity. And then finally, well, almost finally, I've got 2 more slides. There is a victim and community stakeholder bucket. And this is where our restorative justice recommendations live. It's where we are planning to form a victim advisory group to help advise us on the best way to try to go forward and reimagining what our justice system responses could be so that they actually look to restore the harm that is done by crime. I'm going to move a little bit quickly through these last couple of slides. And then we did a bucket that was focused on grant makers. And these recommendations live elsewhere as well, but it seemed to us that for some recommendations, there's already consensus that these are things that should happen, but there's not money to make those things happen. And so by thinking about what recommendations sit in that space, we thought it would be easier to help try and identify opportunities for funding for local communities. And so some of the things that we wanted to do there are related to funding grassroots organizations, funding violence prevention programs, funding, those alternative responses when people call 911, and those restorative justice programs. So that was a run through very quickly. As I said, we are now in our implementation phase, working on a quarterly meeting basis for the full task force, monthly, sometimes more often with our local community and local committees. And you can keep up with the task force at ncdoj.gov/trek. Thank you so much.